My dad raised his glass, pointed straight at me, and said, "No one celebrates bedpan emptiers." A few people laughed. No one stopped him. And what nobody in that room understood was that the man sitting 3 seats away had already seen me on the worst night of his life. I was still standing near the bar cart with a sweating drink glass in one hand and my coat folded over my other arm when he said it. The room was all low, amber light and polished wood and expensive voices, the kind of party my parents loved because everyone in it had a title worth repeating. There were surgeons, hospital donors, administrators, a retired dean, 2 local politicians, and the sort of couples my mother always called well-connected, in a voice that made it sound almost moral. My sister Megan stood near the fireplace, in a pale blue dress my mother had chosen for her, laughing softly at something a hospital board member's son had said. My father had been waiting all night for the right opening. He chose me. No one celebrates bedpan emptiers. He laughed lightly after, like he had said something sharp and clever instead of cruel. A few people smiled the way people smile when they aren't sure whether they're witnessing humor or class violence, but know which side the host expects them to take. My mother made her usual tight little face of polished discomfort, the one that said she was embarrassed by the tone but never by the content. Megan looked down at her champagne. One woman from the foundation gave me that glossy, sympathetic smile people use when they want to distance themselves from the harm without interrupting it. I didn't move. My badge was clipped to the side seam of my black dress because I had come straight from work and changed in the staff restroom with 10 minutes to spare. White plastic, blue letters, my name, my title. A small object my parents always noticed just long enough to decide how quickly they needed to make it smaller. My father's eyes had flicked to it before he lifted his glass. That mattered, because he knew exactly what. He was mocking. I worked nights in hospice. I cleaned patients no one else wanted to touch. I changed sheets at 3 a.m. while grown children stood in the doorway whispering that they just couldn't handle it. I lifted bodies that had become sources of shame to the people still trapped inside them. I knew what panic sounded like when morphine was wearing off. I knew how to lower a voice instead of a person's dignity. I knew how to stay. My father preferred words like helps. My mother preferred compassionate. Neither of them liked skilled. The room was still helping his cruelty settle when my father added, with a proud smile toward the fireplace, Megan, on the other hand, is actually on a path worth celebrating. There it was, the second cut. It was never enough for him to reduce me. He needed contrast. Megan had become the family's unfinished investment, expensive, polished, still full of future in the exact way my parents found socially useful. I had become the daughter whose work they could only describe if they translated it downward first. My mother stepped in on cue. "She has such a big heart," she said about me. Big heart. Another soft phrase used to erase training. My fingers tightened around the drink glass. Condensation slipped across my knuckles. The cold was the only honest thing in my body. Then a woman from the hospital board turned toward me with that practiced bright curiosity rich people mistake for warmth. "So, what exactly do you do?" My father answered before I could. "She works in care." In care, as if I refilled water pitchers and fluffed pillows and stood politely near grief until someone with a credential arrived. As if end-of-life labor had no technical language because it had no prestige. I opened my mouth, but my mother cut in too quickly. "It's very emotional work," she said. "She gets attached." There it was again. Not trained. Not experienced. Not essential. Attached. That should have been the moment I left. I didn't. Because by then I had already noticed the one person in the room who wasn't reacting like everyone else. The Surgeon General wasn't smiling. He was watching me. Not politely, not socially, intentionally. Then his eyes dropped. To my badge. And that was when I understood the room had gone wrong for my parents in a way they did not know yet. The hostess called everyone toward dinner, and the room began to drift in that direction, with little movements of silver bracelets and linen sleeves, and the murmur of well-bred appetite. My father looked pleased with himself. My mother relaxed. Megan glided toward the table in the center of the room like the evening still belonged to her. I was the last one to move. As I passed the Surgeon General, he said quietly, without looking at me directly, "You were there!" For 1 second, I thought I had imagined it. Then he walked on. My stomach dropped so hard I had to set the drink glass down on the nearest side table before it slipped. "You were there." Not, "Do I know you?" Not, "Haven't we met?" You were there. That wasn't even the worst part, because the room still thought I was the one with something to prove. The dining table was long and candlelit, set with cream china and polished silver and folded linen napkins my mother would absolutely discuss later if anyone touched incorrectly. Place cards marked every seat. The host at one end, my father at the other, my mother near him, Megan to her right. I was seated along the window side, with Helen diagonally across from me and the Surgeon General 2 seats down on my left. I noticed the arrangement immediately, because I notice arrangements for a living. Who gets comfort? Who gets view? Who gets center? Who gets managed? I also noticed my place card had no title beneath my name, while Megan's included MPH candidate, even though she had already deferred her program again. That was my family too. They liked titles not for truth, but for staging. Soup came first. The host's husband talked about hospital staffing. A cardiologist talked about research grants. Someone on the board mentioned legacy and public health and meaningful careers. My father sat straighter every time the conversation moved into status. Then he introduced us all properly. My mother was the real reason any of us look civilized. Megan was our future success story, and I was our resident saint. Resident saint. The table smiled. My spoon stopped halfway to my mouth. That word hit differently than bedpan emptiers, because it sounded kind. That was what made it more poisonous. Sainthood is what people assign to labor they want to sentimentalize instead of respect. It strips technique. It strips discipline. It strips wages and exhaustion and muscle memory, and turns work into personality. It says you are not trained, only good. The host smiled at me. "That sounds admirable," I said. "I work nights in hospice." Before anyone could respond, my father said, "Which means she spends a lot of time doing the kind of tasks no one else wants." My mother gave him her false warning look. "Don't go too far too fast. Not stop. Never stop. Just pace it better." The Surgeon General looked at me again. Not with pity. With concentration. It unnerved me, because part of me already knew who he meant when he said, "You were there." And part of me was afraid to name it fully and find out I had imagined the whole thing. That is one of the uglier effects of being diminished for years by your own family. Even when reality finally starts moving in your favor, you distrust it. Have you ever stood in a room and realized your own family had already decided what you were worth before you even spoke? I picked up my soup spoon again and forced my hand to steady. The badge rested against my dress. The room kept climbing toward meaningful careers. My parents kept translating me downward, and the man, too, seats away, who had already seen me once in a room where titles meant nothing and mortality meant everything, remained absolutely silent. For the moment, my parents had been shrinking my work for years, not openly, elegantly. That was what made it hard to fight at first. They did not insult me in blunt language over breakfast. They didn't tell neighbors I was a failure. They didn't forbid me from doing the work. That would have been easier to name. Instead, they polished me down. When I first took the hospice aide job, my mother told people I was helping out at a care place. When I got certified, my father called it a stepping stone. When I moved to nights because the unit was understaffed and the pay differential helped, my mother said, "At least you're the kind of person who can handle sad situations. Not skilled, not trained, not needed, just soft enough to be useful where others would not want to go." The badge appeared early. In that family pattern because it embarrassed them. White plastic, blue letters, uncluttered truth. The first time my father saw it, he turned it over between 2 fingers, read the title, and said, "Well, I guess everybody has a role." That sentence stayed with me for weeks. Not because it sounded cruel to anyone else, because I knew what he meant. He did not mean every role mattered. He meant every family. Benefits from having one child lower in the hierarchy. Megan, meanwhile, remained expensive in ways my parents found aspirational. Graduate school. Then a pause. Then a different graduate program. Then networking years. Then freelance consulting no one could explain clearly. My father funded each transition like it was an emerging company. My mother called every failure a pivot. When Megan wanted a better apartment because clients judge your address, they helped. When she needed a new car because appearances matter, they helped. When she needed a wardrobe refresh before serious meetings, my mother took her shopping and my father paid. They did not think of this as favoritism. They thought of it as strategy. Megan was the child whose future still cast light in the rooms my parents cared about. I had already become exactly what they feared most, a person whose work could not be converted into status no matter how necessary it was. At family parties, Megan got verbs like builds, consults, leads, explores. I got helps. At first, I corrected it every time. I'm a CNA. I work nights in hospice. I'm usually the one still there when families can't stay. My mother would smile too quickly. Of course, that's what I meant. My father would wave a hand as if precision itself were gauche. No need to make it sound dramatic. By the time of that Christmas dinner, I had stopped correcting them every single time. Not because they were right, because I was tired of watching them flatten something sacred into something socially tolerable. At the table, the early pain came in quiet layers. My badge got glanced at and then ignored. A vascular surgeon asked Megan about long-term plans and asked me whether I still liked that kind of work. That kind of work. As if hospice were a phase. As if cleaning a dying person at 3 a.m. were a temporary personality choice. I answered anyway. Some nights I hate it. Most nights I'm glad someone stayed. He nodded politely, already turning away. My father jumped in. She gets attached. There it was again. He always framed my work as emotional leakage instead of practice discipline. Never body mechanics. Never symptom observation. Never charting. Never how to speak to someone whose fear has become bigger than their pain tolerance. Never how to lift without bruising fragile skin. Never how to keep dignity from leaving the room before death does. Just attachment. That is how class prejudice dresses itself in polished homes. It does not say this work is beneath us. It says, with a little smile, she has a heart. The wine glass in my hand became an anchor without my noticing. Slender stem, cold bowl, pale gold liquid. A small, breakable thing I could focus on while the room kept pretending I was soft where I was actually skilled. I thought I could get through the night quietly. I was wrong, because the conversation kept circling back to exactly the kind of language my parents used to measure worth. Meaningful work, legacy, public service, institutional impact, the lives that really shape things. My father lived for rooms like that. Rooms where status floated invisibly through the air and landed on shoulders like blessing. Rooms where he could borrow importance from proximity if he arranged his family correctly enough. At one point, the host asked whether anyone at the table had ever done bedside care personally. There was a beat. My father smiled as if preparing an anecdote. Oh, our daughter has spent enough time with bedpans for all of us. A couple people laughed reflexively. One person looked down. My mother said, Robert, in the same tone women use when pretending a man is more charming than cruel. That should have been the moment I left. I didn't. Because I had already begun to realize the room was not just hearing my father. One person in it was measuring him. The Surgeon General had stopped pretending to be merely social. He barely spoke during the first course. When he did, it was to ask exact questions and then fall silent again. He watched more than he performed. He let other people expand themselves while he stayed still enough to see what shape they took on their own. The first time he really looked at me after the opening humiliation, I thought maybe I had imagined the recognition. The second time, I knew I had not. His eyes went to my badge, then my face, then back to the badge. I felt something move in my chest. Not hope, not yet. Recognition, which was more dangerous, Because if he truly knew me, then he knew me from work. And if he knew me from work, there was only one place it could have been from. A place my parents would never have imagined mattered in that room until it was too late. The host's husband refilled water glasses. My mother complimented the roast. Megan laughed too brightly at a joke that wasn't funny. My father relaxed into the false security of his own narrative, and I sat there with the badge against my dress and the wine glass in my hand, listening to the room discuss real impact while knowing real impact had once taken the form of a frightened old woman whispering through cracked lips that she was sorry for needing help with a bedpan. If the people closest to you kept translating your life into something smaller, how long would you stay quiet before something inside you hardened? By the time the first plates were cleared, I was no longer trying to endure the room. I was trying to understand exactly why the Surgeon General kept looking at me like he had brought another room into this one with him. A room with no candles, no polished silver, no social laughter, just fear, decline, and the terrible intimacy of a last night. The joke should have ended at drinks. It didn't. That was what made it dangerous. Cruel lines gain force when they are repeated casually, as if everyone present has already accepted the terms. By the second time my father said bedpan emptiers, it was no longer just an insult. It was an attempt to fix me in place socially. Between the main course and dessert, one of the hospital trustees made a comment about staffing shortages and how everybody wants recognition now. My father smiled into his wine and said, "Well, no one celebrates bedpan emptiers." This time, almost nobody laughed. The line landed heavier. The trust board woman looked at her plate. The host's husband reached for the breadbasket he clearly didn't want. Megan snapped a roasted carrot in half with too much pressure. My mother gave a little smoothing laugh and said, "Robert always says things badly. Always." There was truth in that word she hadn't intended. Always. Not tonight. Not accidentally. Not after too much wine. Always. That should have been the moment I left. I didn't. Because by then the room had changed in another way too. The Surgeon General was no longer watching me casually. He was watching me with memory. I felt it before I looked up. That quiet pressure of someone's attention settling with intent. When I finally met his eyes, he didn't look offended on my behalf. He looked like a man aligning a face, a name badge, and a night he had not forgotten. Then his gaze dropped. To my badge. He leaned slightly forward. And in a voice so low I almost thought I imagined it, he said, "You stayed with her, the last night." Everything inside me stopped. There are shocks that hit like noise. That one hit like silence. He knew who I was. Not vaguely. Not by type. Not because he respected caregiving in theory. He knew me. From the hospice unit. From the last night of his mother's life. His mother had been admitted under a privacy protocol so strict, most of the staff didn't know who she was until after she died. On paper, she had another last name. In reality, she was proud, frightened, in pain, and deeply humiliated by what her body could no longer do without help. She hated the bedpan, hated the word, hated the dependence, hated needing anyone. One night at nearly 3 a.m, after I had helped change her for the second time, she whispered, "I had a full staff for 30 years. Now I'm apologizing for my own body." I had smoothed lotion into her hands and told her, "You don't owe anyone an apology for being human." She looked at my badge, touched the edge of it with trembling fingers, and said, "You came back." That was what she noticed. Not title, not status, return. I had come back. The last night, her son arrived after 11. Jacket still on, tie loosened. Face ruined in the quiet way serious men's faces get ruined when power has finally failed them and all that remains is waiting. He stood in the doorway for several seconds before walking to the bed. I offered him the chair. I told him she seemed calmer when someone kept a hand on her forearm. When she panicked later, I came back. When she needed changing again, I did it. When he broke down in the hallway trying not to make a sound, I pretended not to see until he could breathe again. You stayed with her, the last night. And now my father was at this table, in this room, in front of this man. repeating bedpan emptiers like a joke. What would you do if the people mocking your life had no idea the most important witness in the room already knew the truth? That was the midpoint shock. Not just that the Surgeon General recognized me, that my parents were humiliating me in the one room where their version of me could not survive if the right person decided to speak. The room kept moving, but it had changed temperature for me now. My mother was talking about a charity gala. My father was describing Megan as still deciding where she wants to make her mark. The host was praising public leadership. Someone asked whether anyone wanted more wine. And underneath it all sat the fact that one man at the table had seen me in a room where none of this mattered. No titles, no donors, no polished cruelty. Just a dying woman trying not to feel disgusting and a son trying not to come apart. That should have comforted me. It didn't. It made me angry. Because I understood, suddenly and completely, how casually my parents would have gone on if he had not been there. How many more rooms they would have explained me in. How many more times they would have reduced my work to sentiment, sainthood, attachment, or the cleanup nobody celebrates. My mother asked the host for the lemon cakes to be passed. My father looked pleased with himself. Then he did it a third time. He lifted his glass again, not a formal toast, just enough to gather the nearest attention, and said, smiling toward the guests closest to him, "Let's be honest. No one celebrates bedpan emptiers." This time no one laughed quickly enough. That pause changed the night. Aunt Elaine went still. Helen lowered her coffee spoon without sound. The host's smile broke in the middle, and the Surgeon General set down his untouched glass. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't, because humiliation does not usually become reversal on its own. It has to be pushed fully past the point where a room can pretend not to understand what it is seeing. What would you do when the room finally revealed it had been wrong about you from the start? I set my wine glass down beside my plate. My badge rested against the black fabric of my dress. My father was still smiling. My mother was still smoothing. Megan was still pretending the edge of her dessert spoon required attention. And for the first time all evening, I stopped wondering whether I should leave. I started wondering how long it would take truth to stand up. If you knew the room was about to flip, would you stay quiet and let it happen? The Surgeon General stood. Not quickly, not angrily. That was what made it absolute. He did not slam down his fork or raise his voice or perform outrage. He simply stood, and because he stood, the room obeyed him before he had even spoken. Every sound flattened. My father's smile faltered. My mother's hand froze over the dessert plate. Megan finally looked up. Aunt Elaine straightened. Helen folded her hands. The Surgeon General walked slowly around the table and stopped beside me. Then he looked down at my badge. That little badge my parents had spent all evening treating like proof of my lesser value now. Sat at the center of the most important silence in the room. He read my name. Then he said, calmly, "She was there when my mother needed dignity the most." No one moved. Not my father. Not my mother. Not Megan. He looked up. Not at me, but at the room. "She cared for my mother in the final days of her life," he said. "She cleaned her, lifted her, stayed with her, and made sure she never felt less human for needing help." The room changed so fast it almost felt physical. My father opened his mouth. Nothing came out. My mother's face emptied. Not with innocence. With calculation failing in real time, Megan went pale in a way I had never seen before, as if the light around her had suddenly withdrawn. The Surgeon General did not raise his voice. That made it worse for them. "This is not about kindness," he said when my mother tried to recover with, "She's always had such a tender heart." He looked at the room again. "It's skilled labor, essential labor. Dignity work." There it was. Language. Clean, precise, irreversible. Those 3 words landed harder than anything else, because they corrected not just my father's cruelty, but the entire structure. He had spent the night building. Not sweet, not saintly, not soft, skilled, essential, dignity. A doctor near the far end of the table nodded first. "He's right." Then the host, shame visibly overtaking polish, turned toward me and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't realize. No, I thought. You didn't. People like my parents survive by assuming no one important will ever ask the right question in the right room. Helen spoke then, quietly enough that the whole table had to lean toward truth to hear it. That line was said 3 times. That helped more than it should have. Because humiliation always tries to rewrite itself as misunderstanding once the room turns against it. My father tried exactly that. I think everyone is taking a joke far too seriously. The Surgeon General looked at him without heat. People like your daughter, he said, are the reason families survive their worst nights with any dignity left at all. Then he looked down at my badge again. That was the power shift. All evening it had been glanced at and dismissed. The object embarrassed my parents because it named me too clearly. Now every person at the table was looking at it. Not because the badge changed, because the room had finally learned how to read it. A hospital administrator said quietly, "That's not small work." Another guest nodded. Then another. Social gravity changed direction. My father was no longer the man defining value in the room. He was the man who had publicly humiliated. The woman the room now understood had done the kind of labor everyone claims to honor, and almost no one wants to look at closely. My mother made one last attempt to soften what had already broken beyond repair. "She gets very emotionally involved," she said. The Surgeon General did not even look at her. "She stayed," he said. Just that. And because he knew exactly what he meant, I felt the sentence in my chest like a second pulse. He meant the last night, the hand on his mother's forearm, the bed change at 2 a.m. The way I had come back when the family had nothing left but fear stayed. The room was utterly still now, and for the first time all evening, my father had nothing ready. If someone humiliated you in public and the truth stood up beside you, would you stay in that room long enough to watch it turn? I didn't speak right away. That mattered too. If I had jumped in, it would have looked like I was grabbing the moment. The best thing about truth when someone else finally says it cleanly is that you don't have to chase it. You can let it occupy the room by itself. Then the Surgeon General said one more thing, low and exact. The worst kind of ignorance is the kind that mocks the labor it depends on. No one argued. Not because no one could think of anything. Because the room had already moved. The shame had changed. Direction. The hierarchy had flipped, and the line my father thought would define me had become evidence of who he was. If the one person your family wanted to impress stood up for you, would that heal anything at all? My father did eventually try to speak. He had to. Men like him always believe language will return if they wait long enough and come back to it with enough certainty. "Well," he said, giving a strained little laugh, "of course we respect what she does." No one rushed to help him. That was the collapse. Not shouting, not scandal, not public exile, just the horrifying experience, for people like my parents, of saying a sentence and feeling the room refuse to carry it. My mother tried next. "Robert only meant she's humble about it." Humble. Too late. The room had already heard better. Words. Skilled, essential, dignity. You cannot successfully reduce someone after another person has named their worth precisely enough. The host apologized to me. A doctor thanked me. The woman from the foundation touched my arm and said her aunt had been in hospice and people like you matter more than most of us know. That should have felt satisfying. It didn't. Not fully. Because correction is not healing. My mother finally tried intimacy, as if it were a household switch she could flip once the room was lost. "You know we're proud of you," she said. I looked at her. "No," I thought. "You like explaining me." I said it out loud. That landed harder than I expected, maybe because it was so exact. My mother went quiet instantly. That mattered more than anything else she could have said. Because once truth is phrased correctly, some people lose access to all their softer lies at once. Megan looked up then, eyes wet. "I didn't know Dad was going to say that." "I know," I said. That was the problem with Megan. She was never the architect of cruelty, just its favored tenant. The room began to move again in the way rooms always do after truth. Coffee got poured, chairs shifted. People rebuilt themselves around a new version of the evening. But the old order did not return. The Surgeon General stood to leave before anyone else. He paused near me. "My mother remembered your name when she forgot almost everyone else's," he said, quietly. That nearly undid me. Not because it was grand, because it was exact. I had forgotten that, or buried it in the part of myself where I store things too painful to revisit often. There had been a night, 3 days before his mother died, when she looked straight at my badge and said my name correctly after spending 20 minutes calling her son by her brother's name. I had laughed softly and told her I'd take that as a compliment. Now the memory returned with unbearable clarity. For a second, the room blurred, not with tears, just pressure. The sort that comes when something you did in service and exhaustion is finally returned to you with meaning attached. My father stopped talking entirely after that. My mother withdrew into hostess duties because she had no other useful role left. Megan offered to help clear plates, and my mother sent her because she needed her out of sight while she rebuilt her own face. I stood to leave before coffee was finished. My mother followed me into the hallway. "I wish you hadn't made it so public," she said. "Of course. Not I'm sorry. Not he was wrong. Not I can't believe we said that. Just the old reflex. Privacy for harm. Publicity for status." "He made it public," I said. She went quiet. That mattered more than anything else she could have offered. Megan appeared at the end of the hall holding 2 dessert forks. "I didn't laugh," she said. "That's not the same as defending me." She flinched. "There are some truths you give your family not because they'll use them well, but because you're done carrying them alone." Helen walked me to the door. "You were right to stay," she said. "I almost left." "I know." That was enough. Outside, the cold hit hard enough to sting. I sat in my car without starting the engine and unclipped the badge. I held it in my palm for a long time. Same white plastic, same blue letters, same cracked corner. At the beginning of the night, it had been something my parents expected me to hide or apologize for. In the middle, it became the object the Surgeon General recognized. At the end, it was simply what it had always been. Proof of where I had stood when other people looked away. The final image that stayed with me was not my father's face when the room turned, or my mother's collapsing smile, or Megan's silence. It was the look on other people's faces when they finally saw the badge correctly. Seen, not softened, not translated, not reduced. That did not heal the family wound. Nothing that happened that night did. I did not suddenly trust my parents. I did not get a meaningful apology. I did not drive home warm with reconciliation. Trust stayed broken. Distance stayed necessary. The scar stayed where it was. But something inside me stopped kneeling. That was enough for one night. I clipped the badge back on before starting the car, and for the first time in years, the object my parents had tried to make me feel small for felt exactly as heavy as it should have. If this hit something personal for you, I'd really want to hear your story. If this hit something personal for you, I'd really want to hear your story.